All right. Welcome back.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me, Mr. Chair. Committee, for the record, my name is Jared Carpenter. I'm with the Lake Champlain Committee. I think this is the first time that I've testified in this committee this year, although I've been up before in the past. So I'm here today to talk about S-124, which is the Ag Water Quality Enforcement Bill. It was initially, well, it was S-100 until it got folded into the Senate version of the miscellaneous AFM bill and becoming S-124. And I'm going to talk specifically about the bill, reflect on a few things that were said yesterday by Steve Collier, some feedback, pushback, if you would, on some of his suggestions, and then we have suggestions of our own. So Lake Champlain Committee is one of the parties, along with Conservation Law Foundation and Vermont Natural Resources Council. We are one of the parties that petitioned EPA about the dedelegation that started this process rolling along, so to speak. It has been, I believe, a total of 4, if not 5 years between putting the petition together and then EPA did a 2-year investigation of their own, culminating in September of last year of putting a letter out in terms of, what suggestions they wanted to see, what changes to make in the CAFO enforcement program. And it came up, and I think it was by Representative O'Brien yesterday. Why did we petition? And Steve really didn't have an answer, and Steve wouldn't, because he's not going to speak for us, of course. But it wasn't out of, it wasn't a vendetta. It wasn't anything against farmers. It wasn't anything against the agency. It's just we simply believed that the system was broken. And I have not sent this to the committee. This is the September 9th EPA letter, but I will, so you have it in the record. But I just wanted to read part of what the EPA put together in terms of these are their findings and their conclusions. And this is under the failure to enforce and monitor compliance from CAFOs. And it's a couple of sentences, if you'll bear with me. It says, ANR's delegated obligations regarding the enforcement and compliance monitoring of the CAFO program are not being met. In general, ANR fails to conduct sufficient and timely inspection and fails to appropriate enforcement actions to deter and mitigate violations. This is because ANR largely relies on AFM to be their eyes and ears on the ground. In fact, state statute codifies a subdelegation where AFM inspects all farms at frequencies determined by farm size. AFM enforces nutrient management planning requirements, and AFM only refers any observed discharges to surface water to ANR. This arrangement often breaks down. Further, ANR lacks sufficient resources to expeditiously inspect farms in response to complaints from the public or referrals from AFM. EPA conclusions are based on review of the materials supplied by the petitioners, our parties, information provided by ANR and AFM concerning complaints and referrals, and independent inspections conducted by EPA in 2023 and 2024. And a few more sentences. EPA reviewed information from ANR and AFM concerning 113 complaints from February 2021 to January 2023. Based on the records examined by EPA, there are numerous examples of ANR or AFM inspectors observing discharges to surface waters. EPA found that a significant number of complaints, 26 complaints or 23%, were unresolved. In addition, despite information in the files including photos and written documentation of discharges, a large number of the complaints, 51% of the complaints or 45%, were concluded as no violations found and no NPDES permits were issued. Finally, very few complaints, 7%, were noted as violations of the Clean Water Act. In addition, between May 2023 and 2024, EPA conducted 10 CAFO at NPDES inspections in Vermont. Several of these farms had evidence of ongoing or recent discharges that appeared unaddressed. I think the system has gotten better between the two agencies. I think having the EPA looking over your shoulder for 2 years helps you get better and working out the kinks of what's working and what's not working. But we saw a system as broken and where complaints and discharges were not being addressed. Therefore, the filing for the dedelegation. We had no intention of EPA taking over everything in the state. But weighing in on the CAFO program, we think was very important because under the Clean Water Act, that's ANR's jurisdiction. And the system of dual jurisdiction where one agency doing inspections and another agency and referring back and forth, it wasn't working. So S-124 seeks to address some of that. Are we completely happy with where S-124 landed? No, we wanted something more complete of a more complete removal of the enforcement actions from AAFM and over to Agency of Natural Resources, not just the CAFO permit, but discharges and pollution from all farms. That's not where this bill has landed, but that seems to be where we're going. So we do have a couple of suggestions, and a couple of issues that we wanted to take up with this, with the committee, and obviously we'll take it up downstairs with the folks in House Environment as well. But our changes we think are bringing the bill closer to what EPA has requested, required for the two agencies to do to address discharges from CAFOs. Secretary Moore reviewed these 7 criteria with the committee. But to reiterate, there was 1, A&R personnel must inspect all potentially jurisdictional farms to determine if a CAFO permit is required. 2, A&R personnel must review nutrient management plans and issue CAFO permits consistent with state and federal requirements. 3, A&R must comprehensively track permitting, monitoring, enforcement actions. A&R must enforce against farms that are discharging without a permit. 5, A&R must have sufficient personnel to fully implement the foregoing requirements in a timely manner. Number 6, A&R must seek the necessary statutory regulatory authority to fully implement the Clean Water Act requirements. And the last one is A&R must include a reasonable but expeditious timeline, including a date certain for the completion of a corrective action plan. S124 is a great start, but we don't think it necessarily meets all of these requirements.
What you just read, that was a list that EPA communicated to the.
Correct.
Okay.
That's what EPA communicated to the state in the September 9th letter of the deficiencies, I guess would be as good of a word as any, the deficiencies that need to be made up by the corrective action plan. A&R submitted their corrective action plan to EPA, and that was the genesis for S100, which is, of course, now folded into as S124, which does have some Title VI provisions that aren't necessarily part of what EPA was requesting, and the Title X provisions that have the CAFO permitting.
Okay.
2 things I wanted to bring up that, Steve proposed a number of changes yesterday. 3 of them make sense to us. The buffer changes, that's rather than the 25-foot buffer, you would be under the buffer that is in whatever the CAFO permit is. Only 1 fee. You're only one paying a fee for an LFO or a CAFO rather than both. Perfect sense as well. And his comments about certified small farm, the annual filing, that just seems like a lot of paperwork.
So are these, sorry.
These aren't here. I'm commenting on Steve's comments yesterday.
And these are changes to the language that's in the Senate version. So
Correct.
So changes that he recommended yesterday.
Correct. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, just wanted to make sure everyone's on the same.
2 things I do want to push back on a little bit. One was there's language in the bill about adding an emergency exemption for manure spreading. We would think that an emergency exemption would be a little bit more defined. It's pretty broad, and exactly how the language is written and inserted in the bill. It just says, or as authorized under an emergency exemption granted by the secretary. When this bill went through in 2015, I remember this committee, the prior members of this committee and the Environment Committee went through the exemptions pretty thoroughly. There's a lot of exemption language in here already. Seasonal exemptions, there's criteria. You have to put in, certain aspects of what can be exempted under what conditions, what requirements need to be followed, certain weather conditions. There's just a lot of exemptions are already allowed under specific examples, under specific conditions, and the farmer needs to petition to get the exemption. And as far as I know, they usually get them. It wasn't quite clear to me. It wasn't quite clear to us exactly why a broader emergency exemption would need to be granted, how broad it would be. Would it be a statewide emergency exemption, a countywide, just by a farm, a group of farms? Would it be under specific circumstances? Flooding of 2023 makes a lot of sense when pits are starting to get fuller, although that was in summertime. We would ask that the committee think a little bit more about exactly under what conditions an emergency exemption would be considered, and perhaps put some criteria and guidance on that. That it's not so broad-based, but it's a little more specificity when an emergency exemption is granted. The other one, and this has been an issue that has been gone back and forth between the environmental advocates and the agency of AAFM for quite a while, is the use of waters of the US versus waters of the state. It is our preference, is the advocate's preference, that waters of the state be used because it is a broader definition of waters than waters of the US. In this case, as Secretary Moore also indicated, the federal government is, for the third time in 5 or 6 years, is looking to redefine what waters of the US means. That's a moving target based on lawsuits, Supreme Court decisions, whoever is in the White House. It would provide much more certainty and be much more grounded in, rather than a moving target on what considers a water, if waters of the state was used rather than waters of the US. Waters of the US is mostly navigable waters and adjacent wetlands, where I have the definition, if folks somewhere in here, if folks would like to hear the definition of waters of the state, but it does include, brooks, smaller bodies of water, which we think should be included because it all ends up in the same water system eventually.
Yeah, thank you. So we as dairy farmers, and especially LFOs, we're familiar with waters in the state,
Mhm.
okay? Some of my colleagues would like to see the waters of the US if they fall under the CAFO, because the CAFO is a federal program. So they say if we're under the federal program, we should be under the federal guidelines.
Right.
Secretary Moore expressed interest yesterday that she wants it to stay. That was yesterday, right, Jim?
Day before.
Day before.
Days ago,
She
yeah.
wants it, they would like to see it stay in waters of the state. Okay. Under CAFO,
Mhm.
farm setbacks change.
Correct.
So, now we're creating an a la carte. We're gonna use the CAFO setbacks, but we're gonna stay with the waters of the state. And some people say it should be both or both, not one or the other. I can, speaking for myself,
Mhm.
I think I can live with waters in the state. I like the state setback program better because I'm used to it.
The 25 feet.
25 and 10.
Yeah.
And of which, we're now starting to implement buffer programs and whatnot, which are a great tool for
Right.
clean water. I'd love to show you one sometime. What is your opinion on what I, just talked about? The waters of the state and the state setbacks or the a la carte?
I see where you're going with this terms. We would prefer, well, few things. One, we would think of, and it's one of the numbers up here, is that the federal CAFO standards would be the floor, and that the state standards could be necessarily more strict than what the floor was set. There's concern about just with waters of the US, it's going to be changed or weakened. There's concern that the CAFO standards could be weakened. So if you're truing our program up, our state program up with the federal CAFO requirements, we could end up through changes through EPA or the federal governments or lawsuits or what have you, you could end up with a significantly weaker CAFO program than what we are capable of here in the state. So we would like to see the CAFO program as the floor, not exactly the ceiling of where these permitting are set. My understanding, and you probably know this better than I do, is under the buffer requirements, it would very much be on a farm by farm basis, correct? In terms of whether or not you're doing a setback or a buffer, or would it be based on where the production area is in terms of where the waterway is, or?
So that's a question I'd have to ask because I don't, if a farm gets designated a CAFO, does it just count for the production area? Or is all your land now under CAFO rules?
I think it's the latter.
I think someone testifying yesterday said that it's the matter.
CAFO is itself defined as a discharge point, which
Yeah.
is a little counterintuitive to people because they think of a pipe as a discharge point, not a entire farm. But it's treated as a discharge point in the definition. So
Mhm.
I can see the point of the 25-foot buffers. That was a fight in these committees too. Initially it was 50 and then should it be 25 and it should be vegetated and not vegetated and harvestable, not harvestable. I'm more of a mind to keep the stricter standards and waters of the state. But have the buffer provisions be more on a farm by farm basis than the standard 25 feet. Because it might
Taking into
be,
account soil type, slope.
because it might be better, there might be better ways to do it from
Mhm.
different farms under an individual CAFO permit rather than sort of a blanket general.
Mhm.
Representative Burke?
Thank you, Chair. I guess I don't have a firm grasp of what the difference is between CAFO setbacks and buffers in the state. So it's hard for me to know which one is better for water quality or better, easier for the farmer. I'd like to know more about that so I can have a little bit more understanding on the topic.
And that's,
We've had, maybe that was done in some testimony earlier.
Might be somewhere in this document we got from Steve yesterday.
that might be,
It's in there. 100 feet with CAFO, if you do nothing, no nutrients can be applied in that 100 feet.
If you do nothing, like
You can't spread manure in it. You can harvest it. Whereas the state of Vermont is 25 feet, no manure.
Yep.
Along a stream. Waters of the state, and if it's just a ditch, then you can be 10 feet away.
but you can't harvest.
So it's 100 feet with cake and you can't harvest it.
You can,
No nutrients past that.
yeah,
Lots 25, and no harvesting.
no, you can,
It's usually hay.
yeah,
So you can harvest?
yeah.
So.
That was another.
CAFO's more strict.
A lot more strict.
So you're saying you would prefer to have the state rule on that or?
I'd prefer the waters of the state rule, which is more expansive in protection of water quality. Because a creek goes to a river, goes to the lake. So it all runs together eventually. And the CAFO standards on buffers seems to make sense because it is gonna vary.
So let me just ask Jared, and this is.
But we're getting further in the weeds than I intended to. Unintended.
I'm sorry, I just tried to.
No, completely. And I'm no expert on CAFO law myself.
Your preference is that the language is already in the bill that we've got stay the way it is.
Both stay the same, correct?
Okay, and we've heard generally anyway that this language was shown to the EPA and they accepted it as is now. So
That's a good start, I think, is what they had some
right. Okay.
details they wanted fleshed out.
But they might, and this will apply to any change I think that we might make at this point. They might say, no, that's not what you showed us. We said this was a good start. Now you've gone backwards by changing it to, and this might be not one of those cases, but I just wanted to flag that we want to be careful about changing anything. Because
Understood. I think
EPA still needs to be satisfied.
yes, and I think the EPA did think the bill was a good start, but understood that it had to go through the legislative process. So, and wanted it to go through the legislative process to get the process started. So I don't necessarily think that they thought the legislature was going to rubber stamp it, so to speak.
Okay. Well, why don't we,
I can go through things
Yeah, why don't we show-
because I know we're getting along. So we had some suggested changes. I'll go through them quickly. I can either come back or I can sit down individually with folks or however you'd like to do it. The first recommendation is to put an inspection schedule in Title 10. Title 10 is where the CAFO schedule is. This is the current schedule that is used. The large CAFOs not less than once per year, medium every 3 years, SFOs every 5. That's the current schedule. It's also in the Title VI provisions of the bill, but we think it would be a good idea to have an inspection schedule in the statute that says, these are the times that inspections would occur, and this should be familiar to everybody because it's the current schedule. Although I think sometimes SFO is 5 to 7.
7 years.
But certainly for the large CAFOs every year. I won't go through all these details, but we have put in some notes that people can look at, references to EPA letter on each of these. And in some cases, something that's a little more O'Grady oriented if somebody decides to go with changes. This is what I mentioned before. Recommendation 2 is to establish the federal language as a regulatory floor, not the regulatory ceiling. So if you see the current language is as consistent and equivalent to the federal clean water, we think it should be at least as stringent as, given some, obviously that federal law is the floor, state law can be more stringent. It would be a little more flexibility for the state. It would also give us a little more protection if the federal law is undermined by the forces in Washington, D.C. these days, so to speak. And these are changes just sort of throughout, just to make it all, consistent. One thing, ANR, as I noted in the EPA letter, ANR is EPA would like ANR to determine what is a discharge and what is not a discharge. There's some current language in the RAPs that there's a presumption that if the RAPs are being followed, the discharge is not happening. We have learned over the years with what I read with the complaints and things of that nature, just because something is being followed doesn't necessarily mean a discharge is not occurring. We think it should be the EPA. We think it should be the Agency of Natural Resources who makes that determination, and there should not be a presumption in the law of no discharge occurring. Similarly, which one is this? This was a problem. This is current language that we have struck out in the highlighted with a strike through that has referrals from AAFM to ANR when something is found. If there's a discharge, again, this should get into Agency of Natural Resources making the determination where there's the discharge. One of the things that got the system into trouble and got us to this point was AFM would do one thing and would refer to ANR, and ANR would do something else, and they go back and forth, and the communications would break down, and there'd be differences of opinion on what's a discharge and what isn't a discharge. We think it would be relatively more straightforward if it says, after inspecting the farm, Secretary of Natural Resources shall issue a written determination. That is all rather put on the shoulders, so to speak, of the Agency of Natural Resources. And this is just language going throughout, just truing it all up to that determination. Clear permitting requirements. This is just more of a language change. Right now it says a large CAFO shall not be required to have a CAFO permit unless one of the following conditions are met. Makes a little more sense to say a CAFO shall be required. A CAFO shall be required to have a CAFO permit if any of the conditions are found. And we sort of true up some of the language down here as well. Explanations. This is something that's in Title VI. If you recall, in the first couple of pages, there is a memorandum of understanding. It's now being changed into a document of which agency has which responsibilities for which, and which has responsibilities for others. The stakeholder group that's meeting over the summer into the fall is actually going to discuss on how the two agencies can work together and have certain jurisdictions. I won't bother reading the language in the interest of time. It makes sense to wait. The MOU is supposed to be done over the summer before the stakeholder group makes their recommendations. Maybe AFM and ANR have a reason they want to do it immediately, but it seems to make sense to wait for the stakeholder group to make their recommendations and then see if the two agencies can incorporate that into how they work together into what is no longer being known as a memorandum of understanding, but just being referred to as a document. But a memorandum of understanding is still a name pretty much. And I think, 7 and 8 are what we have already what we've already discussed. Recommendation 7 is the concerns of the emergency exemption. Thank you, sir. The emergency exemptions from the manure spreading. And the last one is the use of the definition of waters of the state. Thank you.
Recommendation 8 is,
And I apologize for rocketing through that awfully quickly. But like I said, I can, at your discretion, Mr. Chair, I can either come back or sit down with members individually and talk about things and walk you through it. I'm always here.
Representative Martha.
It's a little off this. Sometime back, I was appointed to what's called the Vermont Citizens Advisory Committee on the future of Lake Champlain.
CIC.
Yours is Committee on Lake Champlain. What? Could you give a little background on?
Lake Champlain Committee, the organization. So Lake Champlain Committee was formed about 30 years ago. We are a bi-state organization. We have members in New York as well as in Vermont. Canada too. Board members from all 3 locations. We run the Lake Champlain Committee runs the cyanobacteria monitoring program from the state, but actually the volunteer training starts next week. With volunteers going out and looking for cyanobacteria blooms, things of that nature. We also do a number of educational programs on reducing phosphorus and runoff into Lake Champlain, including, lawn projects, stormwater, things of that nature. And we also have a paddler's guide that we do every year. So we're a nonprofit organization. It's been around for 30, 40 years. We're a citizens advisory committee is, I think, a government structure. There's a New York CAC and a Vermont CAC of just what it sounds like, citizen advisors, comprising of elected officials, nonprofit organizations, citizens, class members. I'm not sure who the members are right now.
Was asked, but I didn't want to stay on. Carolyn B. Brannigan. There's one in the House, and
Senator Brock was for a while. I'm not sure if he still is. Senator Brock.
Yeah, he is. As far as I know, he is.
And I know far less about the New York CAC, I'm afraid.
Do you put out a yearly report or anything like that?
Sure, I can dig something up and send it along to the committee about what we
I
do.
just know that the group that I was in, once a year, they put out a report and they came here and discussed it with.
We put out publications throughout the year, likewise, newsletters, things like that, but I don't think we do an annual state of the lake in the same way the CAC does with specific recommendations going forward of, these are the 5 things that should be done.
Thank you.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Can you, and if you can't, that's fine. I'm hearing from farmers that New York rules are not as strict as Vermont rules. New York doesn't have a winter time spreading ban. Essentially New York is in the other room, as I said the other day, peeking around the corner saying nothing to see over here.
Yes, I was sitting right there.
Yeah, so what, do you know of what or anything they're doing?
I don't,
here?
I mean, I can only sort of pair responses that you've already gotten in that, it's, New York does have a different program in terms of CAFOs and setbacks, and they also have a different TMDL where their requirements are not as, they have different discharge requirements for phosphorus than Vermont does. I think that's sort of rooted into their CAFO program. I don't really have a good answer. I'll see if I can find a good explanation, because I have heard amongst the farming community, the dairy community, that some would prefer a New York program similar to New York. Some would not. It seems to be, no better than I do of how can they do that? And is that a better program than what we'll necessarily have over here? They obviously have a bigger, a much larger dairy industry than we do. One of the reasons they have a different TMDL is they have the Adirondack State Park. And so they don't have nearly as much square mileage of discharge of phosphorus onto ag lands, developed lands, everything else running into the lake. They've got Plattsburgh, they've got Ticonderoga, they've got other places, but they have that very large park where there isn't any development. So that's kept their phosphorus discharges on a different level than ours.
They don't have Lindenville. They don't have Johnson and Hyde Park and all those.
Lots of different, you get into the different waterways where you could get down towards the Otter Creek and the Winooski. It's much more of an influence of, developed lands, impervious surfaces, things of that nature. You get up into the Missisquoi and the Lamoille, and it's more It's more agriculture influences, in terms of phosphorus
You
discharge.
know, on Sable, the Shazy, Cat, those run through massive farm communities as well.
So there's probably a precise number that we could attach to both states in terms of watershed size.
Yes, so there definitely have been, studies on that in terms of what percentage of discharge from each state and how it's broken down by sector.
Be interesting to know more about as we have time.
I have a comment, but I don't want to say it on a hot mic.
I'll see if I can find some relatively straightforward information for the future.
So thank you for presenting this. And yeah, we will have, certainly always folks are free to speak to any of our guests outside the room.
You can find me in the hallways, so to speak.
And we'll see if we have time this afternoon to talk a little bit about these recommendations and the ones that were requested yesterday too. So if there aren't any other questions, why don't we hear from Heather Darby? I see she's joined us on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you for the call.
Wondering if Joshua has joined.
He has.
He's on too.
Oh, okay, great,
Yeah.
great.
Good afternoon to both of you. And
Hi.
thank you for joining us. I think we see a presentation on our webpage that's been posted from Josh.
Yep.
And Josh, I'm wondering if I'm not sure how you want to structure the next hour or so, but if you've already determined that, you can let us know. And if you're looking for suggestions.
I think we're going to let Joshua go ahead first and do some tile basics and then sort of let him take a majority of the time and then I'll kind of talk about some other tile related projects we have going on. And I was also asked to talk about the impact of the right to farm law on farms in Vermont, more the diversity of farms. So I'll let Joshua take it away.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Good to be with all of you. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Give me a second. Okay, are you looking at the presentation mode?
We are, yep.
Yeah.
Looks like cover page.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, yeah, so I just thought I would take probably 20 to 25 minutes here and talk about some of the basics around tile drainage and some considerations related to conservation on farms, specifically in Vermont. And please stop me along the way for questions. And I'm sure we'll have some time at the end too. We didn't want to fill the entire time with the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. So I know I'm not here to talk about climate change, but you can't really talk about drainage on tile drainage on farms or drainage on farms in Vermont without talking about climate change. So just have a couple slides to frame the conversation. So here's Vermont annual precipitation from 1923 to 2022. And that blue line sloping upward across your screen is the trend across the century. So it's been going up. We've been getting wetter in Vermont. When you look at this over the past century, almost 7 inches per century. Not such a big deal really on farms when you look at the data this way. However, when you look at the 2 decades leading up to 2011, which is the year of Tropical Storm Irene, you see a very different trend in annual precipitation to the tune of almost 63 inches per century for that trend line. And this is really staggering for farms who are having to deal with this amount of increased moisture. And anecdotally, we see that this is, that the increase in drainage concerns and the increase in tile drainage implementation seems to align well with this kind of 2-decade period that in the early 2000s to around 2010, farmers were really looking for solutions to all this excess moisture. And I don't have data to support this, but at least in my work, I see that the drainage is probably their number one approach to dealing with climate change and this excess moisture. And I'm sorry, was there a question?
Nope.
Okay, sorry. And so and it dried out for several years. We had actually a couple of years of drought. We had some quote unquote normal years, and then of course everyone's aware of 2023, how tremendously wet that year was. And this figure here is data from Addison County, where I do a lot of my field work. And this is for the months of July and August, and just showing that we had the wettest 2-month July and August period on record, stretching all the way back to 1895. And NOAA reports that we saw almost 16 inches during that 2-month period, but I had localized rain gauges that reported almost 23 inches during that period. So, and of course, these years, this change and these individual years have real impact on farms. This is just a pie chart taken from USDA crop insurance data from the Risk Management Agency that correlates with or is directly reflective of where crop insurance payments were made to farms in Vermont, why they were made to farms in Vermont. And you can see that this is the 2001 to 2010 time period. Again, this is when we started to see this interest in tile drainage really emerge. Excess moisture is by far way and above any other reasons why crop insurance payments were made. So this just supports that. This is having real impacts on farms, and they're trying to find a way to deal with it. And then, but I do want to say that wet growing conditions and drainage itself are not new for Vermont agriculture. This is a quote taken from the Vermont Ag Experiment Station report of 1912. Tile drainage was a thing at that point in time, as were other methods of drainage. But this just kind of reinforces that we live in a really wet place, and drainage has always been important for agriculture, productive agriculture in this state. Okay, I have a few slides just on tile drainage, kind of 101. And this is, some people are familiar with it, but some aren't. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what it is and why farmers are interested in it, and support that with a little bit of data. Artificial drainage is not new. It stretches all the way back to 200 BC. We call it tile drainage because it used to be done with terracotta clay. I'm showing some pictures of some upside down horseshoe style clay tiles. They're on the left-hand side of your screen. These were for decades the most common way of doing drainage, digging trenches in crop fields and then laying these sections of clay tiles in the ground and then covering them back up. Folks have used other approaches through history, from digging trenches and forming upside down kind of bridge like structures with flat stones and then covering them back up. Any way that they can figure out a way to move water, people have done that in crop fields. They usually place these at right below the root zone of the crop. So typically in Vermont now, we place them at about 36 to 40 inches is pretty common. Nowadays, it is this corrugated black plastic pipe that is put into the ground, not the terracotta clay that you see in the picture there, but you can kind of see the black plastic ribbed pipe that you often see. This is the same type of pipe that goes in around homes for footer drains and that sort of thing. And it just lowers the water table below the root zone of the crop, and then discharges it at the edge of the field. And most of the time, this gets discharged in a ditch that is, running alongside the farm field or an adjacent road. There are occasions where this does get discharged into waterways, but most of the time, this is in a ditch alongside the farm field. It's really two reasons why farmers like to drain. One, it improves productivity, and this is well supported in data that's been collected around the country for decades. I'm showing some of the data there. There's a nice figure on the left from Ontario. So I'm looking for data close to Vermont. We don't have good Vermont data on yield as a result of drain land, but I'm not going to read the numbers to you, but you can see the impact it can have on yield. And then on the right-hand side, just a data point from probably the longest running drainage study that I'm aware of out of Ohio that looked at yields in rotation over 25 years. They saw a 30% increase there. I think it not only does it increase yields, it improves consistency, and that's really important so that farmers kind of get off the roller coaster of ups and downs of good years and bad years. It's nice to have a nice level, consistent yield. And then maybe as important as those effects on yield is its benefit to trafficability. So really allowing fields, and this is very important in this context of climate change as well, allowing farmers to get into the field at a normal time when they need to get into the field in the spring and begin spring operations, and then get into the field in the fall and harvest when they need to harvest. And, in short, it just allows farmers to do what they need to do when they need to do it. And those benefits can be just as great as the benefits to yield, as you might imagine. Here's just the one data slide I do have on yields. This is data from Larry Gehring at Cornell. I worked with him during graduate school, and this is from just across the lake in New York. And you can see the benefit that tile has on yields in some forage crops here. It's pretty significant. I will take a minute. All the data I've shown so far has been from field crops and forage crops, but usually when I get calls these days on drainage issues from farms, and a lot of the farms that I know that are interested in investing in tile drainage, it's usually vegetable farmers. And that makes a lot of sense when you look at the value of the crop per acre. There's a lot more to lose in a vegetable crop than there is in a field crop on a per acre basis. So I don't want to leave them out of the conversation here, but even though I know most of these data are from field crops and forage crops. The other benefit to tile, I think, is really important to mention, especially here in the Champlain Valley, is it helps reduce compaction. We see, because of our clay soils, they're very susceptible to compaction when they're moist. The moister they are, the more susceptible they become. So if we can keep those clays drier, and we can avoid damage, we can avoid compaction. Compaction has, negative effects on yield, and it also leads to more runoff. So it's in everybody's interest to avoid soil compaction. Tile has benefits not just in the wet years. I think this is also really important to mention. It also has good benefits in dry years, and that's because it keeps that water table low in the springtime as crops are starting to establish their roots. Because that water table is low in the early season, the roots go deeper, and then those roots are there deep where they need to be later on in the summer in July and August when it becomes very dry. they're deep enough to access some of the water that's deep within the moisture profile. So it's really in most years, tile has a benefit. Tile drainage is done in many different ways. I'm just showing some different configurations here on the left side of your screen. This is really kind of how quote unquote modern tile is installed. And I say modern, even though it's probably been done like this for the past 50 to 60 years. It's put in, parallel lines, which are called field laterals, and all those field laterals connect to a main. And that main is then what discharges to the edge of the field. So there's not an outlet for each individual tile line in a field. It's really many tile lines that are connected to a main, and that's where the discharge occurs. There are environmental concerns with tile, and I think some of the earlier work on this occurred in the Western Lake Erie Basin in Ohio. We like to look there for what's happening with research in that area, because the soils are also heavy clay, and it's a very similar type. Some of the farms are very similar to ours. And they started to see phosphorus being lost in their tile lines probably around 2010, and then several pretty important studies were published in the mid-2010s. And just a quote there on your screen from one of those, and that really raised the flag here in Vermont that we ought to be looking at our tile lines, especially as we saw this increase in implementation of drainage tile following that wet kind of 2-decade period leading up to 2010. And so you may be aware of the drainage rules that were brought forth and implemented by the Agency of Agriculture following some work on looking at tile drainage literature from around the country, and also gathering tile drainage data from the state of Vermont. And I think that happened around 2018. I believe that those new rules were put into place. One of the factors that makes tile drainage, that makes it interesting and perhaps leads to some of these losses of phosphorus. Typically, we think of phosphorus binding really tightly to soil, so that if we see water moving downward through the soil, it would usually remove the phosphorus from it. But in Vermont, we have what's called preferential flow in a lot of our clay soils, and that's where when the clays get dry, they crack. They shrink and swell, and when they dry, they shrink and crack, and that creates these pathways downward through the soil, so that surface water can go right from the runoff on top of the field down through one of these cracks and potentially enter a tile drain if it's underneath that crack. And that can lead to rapid discharge and quick discharge of soil of water that has a lot of phosphorus in it. And so that's one of the primary concerns and why our region and the Lake Erie Basin is concerned with tile drainage, because of this feature of their soils and our soils.
Josh, just
Yes.
Interrupt you quickly here. That is a particular soil type that we're looking at that wouldn't necessarily be the case all over the state or with other soil types.
That's exactly right. Yeah. We see this in the heavy clay soils, primarily in the Champlain Basin, the Virgin soils, the Covington soils. It's really the heavy clay where we see this happening. Anything that's more of a sandy soil or loamy soil, we don't see this occurring.
And this is occurring during a drought. What we're looking at, I would, without knowing anything, I would say, there hasn't been a lot of rainfall.
Yeah,
but
that's
and then you do get a heavy rainfall, and that's where the phosphorus might tend to leach down.
That's right. That's when it's most risky, really, is when it's been dry for a long time and we have a heavy storm. We do see water moving through those cracks because they're there when it's been dry.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Yep. So that's kind of the water quality side of it. There's also been a lot of interest in how does tile drainage really affect the water flow off a field or within a watershed. So what does the scientific literature say about the hydrology of tile drainage? And I have a few kind of findings there and bullet points on the left, but I really want to start with the figure in the middle of your screen there. And this is kind of the primary point, I think, is that the literature really supports that tile drainage tends to reduce the peak flows of water from a field. It dampens the hydrograph, and you see that in that figure where the solid line is the field without tile, and the dashed line is the field with tile. And this makes sense if you think about water is falling on the field, and it has to move through the soil into the tile lines and then through that tile network to the edge of field. And that tends to take longer than if that soil was saturated, an undrained soil that doesn't have tile in it. Once it becomes saturated, all the rainfall on that field then runs right off the surface. And that results in really flashy hydrographs and high peak flows when we have that surface runoff. So this has been documented in lots of studies through history. There was actually a study published just last month that looked at 464 studies, and they did a meta-analysis, and they came to the same conclusion of what you're seeing here, especially in hilly topography. And we don't think of the Champlain Valley as really being hilly topography, but compared to, where it's dead flat in much of the upper Midwest and Midwest, we are kind of a sloping topography. And they saw this was especially true, this dampening of the hydrograph in kind of sloping terrains. So just some data points there on the left, and I'll just, the first three reinforce the figure, and then the last one I think is really important to mention too. And this is not about flow rates from a field, but it's about the overall water that we see leave a field, say in a year's time. We do see more water leaving a field, to roughly 10 to 20% more water in a year's time. If a field is drained, it has tile drainage. And this it may sound, may sound like there could be some negative effects, but I think it cuts both ways. This also helps to maintain base flows and streams that are bordering tiled fields and in watersheds where we have a lot of drainage. So, but it's really a relatively small amount, about 10 to 20% more water leaving the field. So I guess, taking all this into consideration, it's pretty complicated. Tile drainage is not a black and white practice. It's been shown to decrease because we see, more water soaking in because the water in the soil has been drained by tile. We see less surface runoff. We see less surface runoff. We see less erosion from a field. That's been well documented. We hear that from farmers in Vermont. That they used to see a lot of gully erosion, which is a really, I think, rising issue with climate change and these heavy storms we're seeing. But the farmers have noted seeing less gully erosion because their fields were drained. And what is often not discussed is that when we have drained fields and better yields, that means our crops are taking up the nutrients that we put on the field. So any phosphorus in the manure that was applied would be taken up into a crop that is a really healthy crop instead of sitting there through the winter in a failed crop or a really, really short, poor crop, and that didn't take up those nutrients. And then those nutrients could potentially be lost to the environment. And then some work that Heather has done, I really like to cite this, and I'm sure she'll talk about this more, so I won't. But it also, farmers have reported increase their ability to do conservation when they have drained conditions. So I just want to show some of our data from Vermont, and I want to focus on two fields in the Dead Creek watershed that we published in 2022. And we collect data in 2020 and 2021. And I will say these were drier years. especially compared to the last couple of years in Vermont. But looking at your table, if you just look at the total for 2020 and 2021, these are two fields called DC North and DC South. Those are the total pounds per acre per year of phosphorus that we measured leaving those fields. We actually measure the phosphorus leaving the field in the tile outlets on these fields. And you can see their range between 0.7 and 1.12. And this is in line with some of our other monitoring work on other fields in the Champlain Valley. We hover between typically 0.75 pounds to 1.2 pounds per acre per year. And just to kind of frame that from what others have measured in the country, you can see the data from this King et al. Paper in 2015 at the bottom of your screen. This is taken from fields all over the United States, and they found a typical range, of 0.35 to 1.4 pounds per acre per year. So we're right, Vermont's right in this normal range of phosphorus losses. And I think it's really important also to kind of frame this in terms of how much phosphorus gets applied to a field. And Heather may talk about this too, but a farm may apply, I don't know, 80 to 100 pounds of phosphorus in a year based upon what a corn crop could use. And so really we're seeing about 1% of phosphorus that's applied actually leaving the field, which so if you look at it that way, it's really I think great that farmers are able to keep the vast majority of phosphorus on their fields. And then the last thing I'll talk about is no amount of phosphorus lost from a field is desirable, of course. So we've been looking at some approaches to capturing phosphorus in tile drain outlets as it leaves the field. So we've built some large experimental filters at the edge of fields. And this is just a picture of one of those in Bridport, Vermont. It kind of reminds you of a septic type system where we put in these pipes, perforated pipes, and the tile flow gets diverted into it, and that water goes through this media filter, which is really just pea gravel and iron shavings, and the iron binds really tightly with phosphorus and removes it from the water. So they just act like big water filters at the edge of the field. And our data from one of these filters, this is our Shining Star filter from the past 2 years, 22 notable storm events. We've seen removal of total phosphorus of 80% mass removal over those 2 years. And you can see the concentration data on the left, and then the loads or the mass removal on the right. And then in terms of soluble reactive phosphorus, so we have soluble phosphorus in water, and then we have the phosphorus that's bound to sediment. So if we just look at the soluble phosphorus, which is what we're most concerned about for lake water quality, because it's very biologically available, we see cumulative mass removal of 95%. So we're very happy with the performance of these, and looking forward to hopefully continuing this monitoring work if we can maintain funding from the USDA. And then last thing I'll say, and I won't talk about this at all, I don't know if Heather will or not, but we do have a field site, Heather and I, in St. Albans Bay, where we're looking at some tiled fields versus some untiled fields, kind of at the large plot scale. So we're trying to answer this question of, well, it's the $1 million question of what does water quality look like on a field that is drained versus a field that is not drained, and we don't have a really good answer for that. But hopefully this study, Discovery Farms Vermont, will help us answer that. But we're only about 2 or 3 years in, and these things take time, and hopefully we'll have some conclusive data within the next couple of years. Oh, and then I'll just finish. If anyone wants to know more about tile drainage, you can plan your vacation for Geneva, New York, where the Drain Tile Museum is located. And this is where the first tile in America was placed in 1820. That was brought over by John Johnston, and it took his grain yields from 5 bushels an acre to 50 bushels an acre. So pretty cool historic agricultural site there, not too far away from us. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and.
Josh, I want to say, sadly, I've been to the Drain Tile Museum, and I'm not sure it's still there.
Oh, no.
Now, I don't know when you were visiting or when you took the
It's-
picture, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's near my father's. My father grew up in Geneva, actually.
Oh,
so
okay.
travel there regularly, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I stopped in because I was curious,
Okay.
but I think it's not there anymore.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I was in grad school in Ithaca in, yeah, early 2000s. So it would mid 2000s. So yeah, that was a while
I'll make
back.
some inquiries.
Okay. Thank you. Well, yeah. So no one drive over there expecting it to be open without checking online first.
Any questions? I guess the one thing I was just a little stymied by was the idea that there could be a 10 to 20% difference in discharge, just over time. Where does that go, or where does that come from?
Where does it? Yeah, great question. So if you think about, so it's really, that is the difference between where the water table would be in an undrained field to where
Yeah.
the water table is lowered in a drained field. So just that water, so it might be a foot, 18 inches, 24 inches of water table within the field that gets lowered to where that tile line is. That makes up that extra 10 to 20%.
Yeah. And does that over time, those tend to even out? If you get what I mean?
Well, it's spread. It's very evenly spread out through the year. So I don't know if that's exactly what.
No, I
answers
guess
your
I'm
question.
thinking more, you must reach an equilibrium point at some point. So, okay, yeah, you've removed all that extra water between the new water table level
Yep.
and the old. But then once that's been drained, you would think that you sort of go back to status quo.
Yeah, then it stops. Right. You don't see any extra water after that point.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. Josh, what I found very interesting is how you leveled out you put the tile in, you actually created more capacity carrying capacity for the soil. So when we do have those big rain events, we can absorb more and then release it slowly over time.
Yep. You definitely increase the ability to absorb this additional rainfall we're getting, because you've drained, you've wrung your sponge out so it can soak up more water essentially.
All right. Well, very interesting. Thank you, Josh. Informative. So I think we can turn it over to Heather.
I got to unmute myself. There we go.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Yeah. We
Okay.
don't see it. We don't see it at full screen. I don't know if you want to try and.
Let me try again.
Click on the presentation. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, my Zoom wasn't working this morning, so I had to use the online app. Okay. Good.
It's the same as it was before. If you click in the upper right-hand side where it says presentation, like right where on our screen, right behind where your head shows up, that should make a full screen slide instead of a partial slide.
Yeah.
But I mean, we can
I'll see it when I go to share. All right, we'll try again. So as I'm trying to figure this out, I'll to start talking. But so as Joshua mentioned, back in 2019, or 2018, we conducted a survey. We did a lot of work on tile. There was a lot going on with the Ag Agency and in the legislature, and a lot of question around what was coming out of tiles and concerns that individuals had around nutrients moving out of tiles. And, at the time, there was an increase in the amount of tile being installed. And part of that, as Joshua had mentioned, really had to do with the fact that it was getting wetter and wetter and wetter and more difficult for people to farm the land that they had in production reliably. And so there was more tile going into the ground, and this raised a lot of questions around water quality and the impact that tile was having on water quality. And so our team at UVM did a lot of tile sampling. Joshua and his team did a lot of work as well. We did a lot of surveying, try to understand, where tile was and what was being tiled, and the impacts of that. As a result of all of that work, there were, regulations around tile that have been put into place, and tiles now are also managed through nutrient management plans and considered in nutrient management planning, which they weren't before. And that I'm trying to remember how many years ago that was now, but 5, maybe 6. And I think Laura is testifying as well, so maybe she can share some of that work. But we've been looking at tile for a long time. Okay, here we go. Pop up, minimize. That's not doing it.
That'll work.
I don't know.
It's good enough. Go ahead.
Good enough. Okay. So we did conduct a study back in 2018. It was a survey, and trying to really understand, is tile drainage a conservation practice? And still today, depending on who you ask, people would go one way or the other. And if you ask most farmers or even individuals at NRCS, and installing tile, actually, I believe, is still a practice on the books through USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, because it was considered a conservation practice. At least in Vermont and around us, it's no longer cost shared through NRCS, but I believe it is in some other states. But when you ask most of the agricultural community, they would answer yes. Having tile is part of a conservation program and plan on a farm, because of all the reasons listed here. It improves field conditions, it increases people's ability to adopt and implement adequately other conservation practices like no-till, cover crops, reduced tillage. It allows people to really be more timely and accurate in their work by applying manure more timely under conditions that are more conducive, timeliness of tillage, fertilizer applications. For many farms, it was reducing pesticide use. And of course, as we heard, the benefits for farms are, liability, increases in yield, etc. So it allows for more implementation of conservation practices and increases farm stability. So when we surveyed farms across Vermont, we captured about 60,000 total acres. And maybe to put this into perspective, We assumed most people that were going to send them back had tile, but there's about 90,000 acres plus of row cropped annual crops in Vermont. About 1 million plus acres of ag land. So 60,000 acres is quite a bit of acreage to cover on this survey. And you can see of those 60,000 acres, the majority of the acreage was not tiled. But what we did get back was about 15,000 acres or so, again, of the survey respondents had tile. And as Joshua mentioned as well, people that answered the surveys had vegetables, they had apples, they had blueberries, they had row crops, they had hay and pasture, and there was tile in all of those systems. People were utilizing tile.
Question for Representative
Yeah, is
Nelson.
that your second slide, Heather, that we're
Yeah,
not seeing?
sorry. You
Yeah,
can't, I don't know how to fix
Oh, there we
that.
go.
I wish I
there you go.
Now we see it.
Thank
Okay,
you.
there we go. We're just gonna go this way. Okay. So can you see
it's
before
a new
tile
one.
drainage?
Yeah,
Yep.
Okay. So when people were asked to answer the survey, they were asked to answer questions kind of before they had tile and after they had tile. So before they had tile, in at least 1 out of 5 years, 75% of the farms experienced crop failure. So that's quite high. Pretty good odds that before they tiled, they were going to see crop failure. And Joshua showed that in his slide too. 98% of the farms said that they had depressed yields or lower yields clearly than they wanted. And 99% of the farms said that they had to implement field practices in less than ideal conditions. And none of the farms were meeting or exceeding their yield goals. And so after tile, almost all the farms said they had yield improvement, and almost all the farms said that they had more timely implementation of their field practices. So again, these are self-reported, but again, people expressing what tile had done for their farms. One of the quotes we collected through the survey was, "Without it, we would have to double our environmental footprint or the number of acres to obtain the same volume of crops." So in some cases, the yield increase was quite substantial when people implemented tile. And again, the little pie chart down below just is showing that all aspects of agriculture, are utilizing this practice. So, one of the questions we really had was around, would people be better able to implement conservation practices? So practices that, at that time and today are sometimes they're a requirement of a farm to meet regulatory requirements like an NMP. Sometimes they're practices that farms want to implement for various reasons to help with conservation. But regardless, farmers found that they were able to increase the percentage of what we were calling conservation practices after they installed tile. So, you can see people were more able to install or utilize no tillage, more able to implement cover crops or other reduced tillage type practices. Farmers were reducing pesticides, and all in all, they were better able to fully implement their nutrient management plans once they had fields that were better drained. Okay, so again, that was survey data, farms, basically asking people for their thoughts. People clearly were not going to invest in tile drainage unless they thought it would have an impact. It's a big investment, but for many farms it was. like Joshua said, there's very limited data in Vermont. Actually, I don't think there's much at all showing the impact of tile drainage on yields and quality and other practices. There's not much research at all. Part of that, honestly, is because tile drainage has really, or installing tile has really picked up in the last decade. Unlike other places, you know, if you go north of us, just north of the border here, lots of tile drainage in Quebec, a good amount in New York, but Vermont really, in the whole scheme of things, you know, we don't have or haven't had a lot of subsurface drainage throughout the state. But, you know, with increasing water rainfall, people are finding it absolutely necessary to continue farming. So Joshua mentioned Discovery Acres, which is an on-farm project in St. Albans Bay on very heavy clay soil in an impaired watershed. And this is a very unique project. And I, you know, can't thank actually the state of Vermont, the Agency of Agriculture, enough for believing in us and providing us our first funding to do this research. Now, this project is funded fully through the Lake Champlain Basin program, but this is a very unique research project. And, you know, Joshua knows this landscape better than I do, but I believe it's one of the only ones like it in the country where we have kind of these paired watersheds right in the same field. So this is in a commercial field down in St. Albans Bay. And they're split into tile versus no tile, with and without best management practices. And these kind of research plots are, you know, between 3 and 4 acres in size. And then there's edge of field monitoring at the edge of the field to collect water quality samples from surface runoff and from tile and surface runoff. So it's very unique in that way. The BMPs that we're looking at are no-till, cover crops, manure injection, analytics, you know, so following soil tests, following pre-side dress nitrate tests, you know, really implementing fully the nutrient management plan, compared to sort of a control where we're using, I would say, we're still using cover crops, but these are fully tilled fields. We're following the nutrient management plan, but we're not doing sort of the extra analytics that we're doing to determine nutrient rates and things like that. And so, as Joshua said, this project is just starting, but I think there's been a couple of agronomic points that have been really interesting that I wanted to share. And part of this is to show you the power of tile drainage and how this could really and is impacting conservation, but also nutrient loss in a way I hadn't really thought about it before. So here we're looking at cover crop biomass production, and the blue bars are the BMP plots, right? So these are the ones that have no till, they have manure injected. So we're not, you know, working up the surface. In some cases, because it is no till, we're letting the cover crop grow longer because we're not worried about getting out there to till the field. And so the first thing I want you to see is the difference in cover crop biomass, right? So this is above ground growth, which, you know, it's not equivalent to what's growing down below the surface, but the more above ground growth, the more biomass on the surface, you know, better erosion control, but also the more root biomass that we have. So with BMPs, and again, the BMP here is injection and no-till, you can see that we have more cover crop biomass because we're not as anxious to get it terminated with tillage. And so you can see here in the tile at part of the fields, those treatments have much higher cover crop biomass than where we don't have tile. And I think this really, to me, was a testament to, wow, I can't believe how much better the cover crop is growing under these tiled conditions versus no tile. So, you know, in adopting a cover crop, that's great, but the more biomass you have out there, the better. That's what's really, you know, reducing erosion and improving soil health. So this really was showing us that tile, with all these BMPs and the no-till, right, the blue bars, we're getting more biomass, better growth, and more, right, more ecosystem services out of the cover crop versus the control, which is, I got to worry about tilling this field. So I got to worry about, you know, getting rid of this cover crop as soon as I can. And that's not doing the same service. And then when you look at ground cover, so how much of the soil gets covered by the cover crop, we also saw a huge difference. And this makes sense, right? You have more biomass, so you have more leaves basically and stems covering the soil. So again, just leading to less potential for runoff and erosion, and impact, you know, and wind erosion in some cases too. So under tiled conditions, with the no-till and all the other BMPs, we saw upwards of 40% ground cover, which is great. We like to see 30, so we were exceeding that. We weren't seeing that with any of the other practices. So this is the part that I don't know why I should have been shocked, but when I saw this and then I started putting the numbers to this, I thought, wow. So this is only in the BMP plots, right? So these are treated equally, except that one part of the research is tiled and the other part isn't. So what we do, the extra analytics, is we go out and we measure soil nitrates in the cornfields to determine if we'll need additional nitrogen to meet the yield goal of the corn. In this case, the yield goal for this farm is 20 tons of corn per acre, right? So the reason to do these extra tests is it helps determine more accurately how much nitrogen is being released from organic matter, manure in particular. So you can see in the tile field, or in the tile aspects of the field, we had more soil nitrates left, right? Left over from the manure that was applied in the fall. And the results said that we needed 65 more pounds of additional nitrogen to get a 20-ton corn crop. Where we didn't have the tile, we had a lot more nitrogen loss. There's less soil nitrates. And it said we needed to apply an additional 105 pounds. So when you think about, well, farm economics, this is huge, right? I mean, this is a big difference in the amount of nitrogen somebody would need to buy. But when you think about the environment, this is also huge, right? Because the same amount of manure was applied to both of these sections.
And then we have a question.
Yeah.
Heather, Representative Nelson here.
Yeah.
Hi. In your tiled section, you had a much more robust cover crop.
Yeah.
And I assume you did this P-test, nitrogen test.
Yep.
You did it in like late June, mid-June?
Yeah, right before when somebody would
Yeah.
top dress, when the corn is about
So,
knee high.
You
Yep.
suppose it was the breaking down? And
Could be
this
a
was
little bit.
no-till, so it was
Yep.
the breaking down of the cover crop also feeding, supplying the end?
It could be, but one of the things I think also might be happening is that we're seeing less nitrous oxide losses
Yeah,
because there's better drainage and more airspace in the tile soils, which there's some evidence to support this in the literature that nitrous oxide losses in heavy clay, you know, is high because of high potential saturation of the soils. And some studies have shown that when you have tile, you have better aeration and you reduce nitrous oxide emissions. This is from 2023, so that's completely possible, right? With all that rain. So I mean, this is huge. This is huge from a climate perspective too, right?
it is.
Is
it?
And again, there's very little. So we're hoping in starting this fall that we will start measuring emissions from these fields to get a better handle on this. So here you go, right here. This is our first crop yield data off of this trial. Tile fields had 21 tons and non-tiled had 10.8. We added more inputs. We added more nitrogen and we got half the yields. So this is not, it's not just an economic farm deal here, right? Of course, the farm is putting in less potential, right? The crops are utilizing the nutrients better because they're growing better. There's more airspace, more optimal conditions. This is some of the stuff that Joshua was talking about. We're getting double the yields with less inputs. And less loss, right? Where did the rest of that go? And so I think, again, this is just very preliminary. I think the other point I want to make here is that there is no way that this farm would have ever implemented no-till. But now they can see with tile, it's completely possible, and they can maintain and exceed the yields that they get with tillage. If they tried to implement no-till without tile, you can see they're getting half the yields. So when we start talking about, what does tile do for the whole picture, right? Right now, this looks relatively positive. The story's yet to completely unfold. There's a lot that we're looking at, but I think this is some of the beginning of really understanding when you look at a system-wide benefits and drawbacks to tile. These are the kind of studies we need to be doing. So, but I think it has been clear thus far that having tile is allowing us to get better cover crops, allowing us to implement no-till where we would never have been able to before. And we're also getting more out of the nutrients that are being applied to fields by using, by having tile, using best practices, and using these additional analytics. So I think, that's all been positive. But again, this is very preliminary, as Joshua said. We're only in our first full year, actually, of implementing these practices. So more to come. But that's what I'll share on that.
Reverend Nelson, did you have a question you wanted to ask her?
Yeah, Heather, the N2O, is that nitrous oxide?
Nitrous oxide, yep.
Okay, so that's the pollutant. It's the same as the pollutant from diesel engines. And if you lower the N2O release and you're increasing your yield, requiring less acres to grow the same tonnage, the carbon footprint shrinkage has got to be huge from that.
Yeah, I don't, again, I'm speculating what's happening there. There's evidence to show that when you have tile in row cropped fields like this with heavier soils, and actually they've even shown this in lighter textured soils, that you have less nitrous oxide emissions. I'm wondering that's my hypothesis that is possibly what's going on down at Discovery Acres, because those are very heavy soils. We wouldn't think, I mean, there can certainly be leaching, but a lot of the losses we see in those very heavy saturated soils is N2O losses, not necessarily nitrate leaching. So, I think that was an eye opener to me, and that's why we want to look more closely at this. Clearly those crops are more efficiently using the fertility that's being added. And that in itself, you just think, I mean, just thinking like, oh, wow, I can put on 40, 50 pounds less of nitrogen and get double the yields. Like, that's pretty, right? I don't have to, do the dollar cents on that. But anyway, so I think there's a lot for us to unpack here. But very exciting, and I think very cutting edge work happening here in Vermont. So got to thank Joshua for leading all the water work. I'm just doing the agronomy stuff. So
Good
Yeah.
stuff.
Heather, thank you. And Josh, thank you. And is there more that you wanted to add, Heather, before we wrap up?
yeah, I just I know you had asked maybe if I could just talk briefly, maybe 5 minutes on the right to farm law and the impact on farms in Vermont. And I work with so many types of farmers. I don't know if you folks know this, but I also own a farm. And, I'm a 7th generation farmer here in this state. So maybe I'll provide you my experience, and I'll remove my extension hat officially at 241, and talk about my own experience as a farmer, and growing up in a very rural community here in Alburgh, Vermont. That used to be mostly all farms, a lot of dairy farms, just a handful left now. And I came back to Vermont. I mean, I'm old now, but when I was younger, that's all I wanted to do. I know I see Richard laughing. That's all I wanted to do was to come back to Vermont and take over my parents' farm. There are a lot of barriers, a lot of heavy lifts, but I did it with my husband and my son now. But it is really difficult to farm. Even, I mean, where we are, it's mostly now second homeowners in the summer, neighbors we don't know anymore, people that really know nothing anymore about farming. And we've had some real challenges with the people around us, and I love my community dearly, but times have changed. We're a small, certified organic vegetable farm. We feed our neighbors. We feed people from all over the place directly. And we've had several altercations where we've had people throwing stones at our manure spreader, beating our tractor with sticks because they didn't like the smell of the manure. We were spreading poultry manure. We do that once every other year. You try to do everything right. The wind is the right direction. Everything's great. And then you go out there and start spreading, and immediately, shoot, the wind shifts direction. And your neighbors out there screaming at you at the top of their lungs And even when you try to take every bit of patience that you have to talk it through, it doesn't always work. I think often we think that education is what people need to understand what we do. And I actually disagree with that. I think there are some things, but people just, they don't like the way things smell. They don't like the way things look. And even when you explain why you're doing it and all the great things about it, they still don't like it. And there are a lot of people that are like me, that have farms my size, that have been here for a really long time. And, I think the right to farm is, and this legislation is really important for every farmer in this state. And I know there's been a lot of emphasis on larger farms, but it's not just for them. And actually, I think more so for many of us that are small, we just don't have the same resources sometimes. So I think, this is important. We live in a state that has more and more people. There's also something I don't think people are considering in this conversation, which is our ability to produce food, and what's at risk if we're not protecting the people that do that. And I know it's hard for so many people to think, oh, well, what does that hayland do? Or what does that dairy farm do? Are they really producing food for me? And I think people that say that are really missing the point. Vermont has the most agricultural land in all of New England. Right now, New England, I think, only produces about maybe 14 or 15% of its food. We have climate change and loss of ag land, and we're at risk, right, of food insecurity. We saw that during COVID. And, if we're not protecting both the people and the land to feed ourselves today and into the future, that's a problem. And we hear that over and over. But until there's a crisis, like COVID or the next fire in California or whatever it is, we don't act. This is the one thing that we can do to act, right? To protect the people of Vermont, to be able to have land and knowledge, farmers that can feed us into the future. So I hope that we don't kind of miss this opportunity. It's critical. It has been for a while, but people don't seem to understand that it's more than just protecting farm today. It's like, how are we going to protect us for the long term and into the future? And it's getting harder and harder and harder to farm here mentally, right? It's just, it sucks when you wake up and your neighbors just don't like you.
Heather, I was going to ask
yeah.
about that, and I'm sorry to hear that you've got neighbors like that. And I know you're not.
They still shop from us. They still come over and buy their food from us.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, after they're done shouting, where, what happens next? And is this something you deal with every time you're out there? And I know you said you're only spreading once every 2 years. And
yeah, every time the spreader comes, it's like a nightmare. And, the funny part is they have, chickens and some geese and I don't know, a bunch of different fowl. And they're always all over our fields and eating my vegetables, and just no respect in that direction either. So I think, it's hard. And And I do feel like we've done our best and we do a great service for the people in our community. We provide affordable, healthy, nutritious food. And, you know, it's just something we're dealing with, and other farms are too, a lot of other farms. And I help them deal with that on a professional level. You know, I've had to play mediator a lot between neighbors and farms, try to explain to people, you know, why is a farmer spreading manure in the summer and not in the winter? You know, we actually hear that. Why can't you just spread this in the winter? You know, so, you know, there's just not an understanding at all anymore. So anyway, for whatever that's worth, you know, this kind of legislation is important to the long-term, you know, food security for this state. We need to have farms.
Representative Nelson, the final question or comment?
Yeah, Heather, thank you. Thank you for that. And if you, the people, the farmers of the state of Vermont consider you the holy grail of experts. And if you're having a hard time with it, I don't know how come the rest of us just haven't been run off. And do you feel it? Do you feel it's incredulous when somebody has got a mouthful of food and they're yelling at you?
And that's how much we love our neighbors, Richard, is that we don't hold a grudge with them.
We
It
let
hurts
them,
every time. And I mean, it's unbelievable, actually. You wouldn't believe it, like the scene.
yeah.
And every time my husband Ron goes over there and he tries to talk and you just can't, you know, there's nothing you can say. But then, yeah, come over and buy vegetables from us, let their chickens run all over our goddamn place. But that's fine. You know, I think it's important that, you know, people understand that this is across all farming types. I hear it. I get calls all the time. Different people ask me to talk to their neighbors, ask me to do a lot of things. I'm not a social worker, although I think in extension, I see Joshua, like half the work we do is like social work between, you know, for farmers themselves, but also between farmers and neighbors. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Heather.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you both for your for the earlier testimony as well on the tiles. I think we'll
Great.
wrap
You guys
it up.
have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too. It's a nice day out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.